Friends, it's OGP podcast. Where is always I'm Adam Arber, by the healthy, the wise, Mr. Andrew Makowitz. How are we, sir?
I'm doing okay. The listeners want to know how you're doing, though. Really, how are you doing with the Nets?
What's the emotional state of a man on the edge? Listen, it was a weird one. Obviously, the Nets, that's what Andy's referring to. The Brooklyn Nets fall over the weekend to the Milwaukee Bucks in Game 7. Feel free to go check out the podcast if you want, Locked On Nets, where, it's funny because of the injuries, right? It makes it such a weird thing. If they had been healthy and they lost, obviously it would feel different. If James Harden had been 100% and they lost, it would feel different. Like, there's so many different versions where you'd be a little bit more upset or taking it a different way. Unfortunately, this almost just feels like the culmination of the season. Little odd, a lot of ups and downs, not a lot of time together for the superstars. And it's almost like everyone goes, now push that pause button and we'll see you at the start of next season. Fired back.
Well, and now we have 4 teams that have not won a title since the merger. So it'll be interesting to see how the NBA landscape plays out in the last thing. But we are not the We Got Nets podcast. We are the One Giant podcast. And Adam, talk to me about what the listeners want to hear about today.
Listen, we're going to get into the 53-man roster. Ed Valentine put out a projection for the 53-man roster ahead of training camp a few days ago. And I think there's just some nice areas that we can kind of dive in on, especially some positions and guys that are carryovers from last year that maybe we're not sure what the fluidity is going to be, who's coming or going. So we will touch on that, but we'll kick it off with number 10 in your playbooks, friends, and number 1 in your heart. Twofold. Eli Manning is 1, rejoining the New York Football Giants organization. He's going to be out there kissing babies, shaking ladies, however the phrase goes, as a bit of a fan liaison, which is the person. Me, as I got a little bit muted there for a second. He's going to find himself over on September 26th at Giants Stadium against the Falcons, having his number retired and entered into the Ring of Honor. I mean, this is the culmination, right? And it's nice after he's had a bit of time away, an opportunity to just step back from football in general, which is what he said when he retired. And now he's going to, get his toe back in the water here. And it'll be nice to see 10 go up into that circle. And you, Andy, a season ticket holder, I'm assuming are going to be there in the stands for that experience.
Yeah, to start off, it's always interesting when a franchise legend has to retire and hang up the cleats, so to speak. And, what you realize is if they stick around for too much or too long after they retire and they immediately go into a role or they immediately become an ambassador, it kind of muddies the water. All of a sudden people are like, well, if Daniel Jones struggles, couldn't Eli just come down and participate again? Can't he just jump in for one game when we really need him? And giving a year breather, I think, was a sign of respect from Eli Manning to Daniel Jones to be like, look, this organization needs to end the era of me being the starting quarterback. We can have me as part of the Giants franchise for, decades to come. But really, we got to let this team hit the reset button for 12 months. I can come back in once Daniel Jones has been established as the quarterback, and we can celebrate that part or that era now that we've had a year away from it. Now we start the new era of the New York Giants with Saquon Barkley and Kenny Golladay and Daniel Jones as the quarterback. So I think it was really smart to take that time off. And, he used that time effectively. He's hilarious on Twitter. He's got all the old dad jokes, about Tom Brady, and he really nails that piece of it. So it's nice to have Eli Manning back into the family. You kind of knew he was going to come back in some capacity. Great to have him back. I think the amount of time was the perfect amount of time for the Giants to reset and go a whole new direction now.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting too. I mean, I think it served, to your point, the franchise well, the young rookie quarterback or second, third year quarterback in Daniel Jones well, and it serves Eli well though, because now he comes back a year removed and fans get to separate the end of his career, which was not as shiny as we hoped it would have been, and how we really feel about him, right? 2 Super Bowl championships, 2 Super Bowl MVPs, and all of the things that we appreciate him for. So I think it's good on both sides. And I think this is just the start of it. I'll be very curious to see what the arc of his relationship with the Giants organization ultimately grows into. I think this is, again, this is the nice way to do it, where he still has young kids. He still wants to do the family thing, gets to have some fun, be a part of the organization. Down the road, I think that his role is going to grow into a more serious and run office. I just think that there's some capacity here where he's going to impact the football team in a lot of different ways. But this is going to be a fun introduction to that relationship.
Well, I was going to ask you, do you think he's going to end up going the John Elway route, where he ends up being some type of general manager, helping with talent development and player personnel? Like, do you think he's going to get to that level, or do you think he just wants to be a part of the Giants organization as an ambassador, and maybe will just be a little bit behind the scenes giving recommendations?
Yeah, I think of it more like, the New York the New York Yankees done a lot of this, bringing in former players for the off-season programs, right? And a lot of young guys will say, oh, I picked up a lot of great tips. Right now, I think it's a little bit tentative because you have someone like a Jason Garrett, who's the voice in the room for the QBs and for Daniel Jones, and he's a former QB as well. But let's say that he gets another job after this season because the Giants have a great offense in the upcoming year. Well, now all of a sudden there's an opening for someone that Daniel Jones can lean on in his 4th and 5th year and maybe help that growth process. So I think it'll be dictated by who's available there. I don't know if I see him rising to the level of general manager, but I do think that there is a more than just in name, right? More than in title role within the organization. But it's hard to say because I don't know what his capacity is in an evaluation standpoint, right? Or how invested he would want to be in scouting college talent. I don't know how deep into those waters he would want to go. And it's, it's almost comical to think of it because on the surface you go, oh, he's just all shucks Eli and he's telling dad jokes. But we also all know the Manning family overall, and certainly Peyton and then down to Eli, they were always regarded as among the smartest quarterbacks in the league, very driven, in the film room, studying, working on their craft. So those are the type of intangible things I think you can pass along to almost any position on the team.
Well, I think what the clear distinction is, I don't think either of us feel that Eli will come back in any kind of coaching capacity. I don't see him grinding away, putting in the work, becoming the quarterback coach for the Giants. Like it doesn't fit the brand of Eli. It feels like it would dilute what he's meant to the Giants if he just takes a positional role. And also like the grind that those coaches have to go through and sitting and watching film and tape until 2 a.m. and then coming back at 6 a.m. Like I feel like he's made enough money in his career and he's been successful enough where, some kind of front office position where you get a little bit more flexibility and you get a little bit more control over your schedule is probably where I see Eli Manning at the end of the day.
Yeah. And listen, like we say, no matter what, it's going to be great to see him back in the building and around the Giants, the players and the facility. September 26th, mark it down. We'll probably do some things leading up to that. And then Andy will be able to give everybody the inside perspective of actually being at the stadium for what should be just a fantastic opportunity for fans to give Eli Manning a little bit praise and a couple more cheers as he enters the Ring of Honor. Now, on the flip side of it, we had talked about, we're going to get into at some point this week, some of the most important players. Maybe we'll start to touch on a couple of them here and really beyond Daniel Jones has a big year. Obviously, that's very important. Listen, those are some of the obvious things, right? But there's other players at key positions that we think are going to be important. But I did find it interesting. Ahead of training camp, Ed Valentine came out a few days ago with his projected 53-man roster, and we'll see. Things can shift in training camp, but there were a few position realignments on the defensive side of the ball. And then certainly we have some guys that were brought in just this offseason, like a John Ross that you and I had talked about, wondering how some of these roles all shake out because there's very crowded tight end rooms, very crowded wide receiver rooms, and then even the defensive front seven is really filled with 12 to 15 guys. And how are they going to work themselves out too? So when we roll through, we're going to gloss over something like the quarterback room where the assumption is it's going to be Daniel Jones. And then obviously Mike Glennon is probably going to be the one there. Valentine just went with just 2 quarterbacks on the roster, which is a little bit more traditional to what football Giants have done in a number of their years, going back to Eli Manning's time. You get into the running back room, Barkley, Booker, Brightwell. Obviously, you have also Mazzell, Platzgummer, Armstead, Clement. Valentine has it with Barkley, Booker, Clement, and Brightwell. Does that seem like a foregone conclusion to you? And really, I think it hones in on Clement being the veteran versus Armstead, younger, but certainly not as proven.
It does, and there's two reasons why. One is you have to keep 4 running backs on the roster because of Saquon Barkley's health, right? We don't know how the Giants are going to ease him back into the role, if he's going to be full steam ahead early. And if he's not 100%, you only have 3 running backs on the roster. All of a sudden, Devonte Booker is your number 1, and he's only got 1 guy behind him. How do you turn that over? How do you get the right reps in a game? Like, you got to keep people fresh. You got to make sure that you can have people situationally. So I think it's pretty obvious the Giants are going to keep 4 running backs at least for the first part of the season while Saquon works himself back into health. I don't think that there's that much of a surprise when it comes to Corey Clement being in. I think he brings that pass catching dynamic out of the backfield that the Giants may not have. Saquon Barkley can catch passes, but like we said, we don't know what his health is. Booker needs to be that number 2 type of guy that if Barkley is out for an extended period can step in and immediately contribute and be getting 15, 18 carries if Saquon's not there. And Brightwell, the interesting part about it, and you highlighted it, I think, when we talked about him previously, his special teams experience allows you to use him in a variety of ways. He can grow with this roster. He can contribute on special teams. And if he ends up looking really good and the moment isn't too big for him, you could see a moment in time by week 3, week 4, week 6, whatever it may be, that he kind of usurps Clement and becomes that number 3 running back if he can catch passes out of the backfield and contribute on special teams.
Yeah, and by all indications, he caught the ball pretty well in the mini camps, so he indicated that he can do that, obviously, and then you mentioned it, the willingness and desire to be a factor, not just do it, but he wants to have an impact on special teams, and that's, as Valentine points out, that's special once upon a time before he took over as the head coach. So it's a nice role there, and I think it's something that, again, so do you think that the indications here, thinking about a room that has 4 potential in Rudolph, Ingram, Smith, and Toaloa? Toaloa is the one that, are you surprised by Toaloa being in this group? Because it feels like predictively you would assume he might fall.
I don't see it being that big of a challenge having Toaloa on the roster. I mean, when you think about it, Kelvin Benjamin was just a kind of a warm body that came in towards the end. They want to see if he has anything left. If he shows up in preseason, catches 3 touchdowns, and shows that he can be a capable blocker, maybe things change. But the Giants had, this is pretty consistent with what they're doing. They move, they moved in the offseason to bring in Kyle Rudolph. You have Caden Smith. This feels right to me from the tight end position. I think what's more surprising to me is, the wide receiver group. And to this point is the fact that they only have 5 wide receivers listed, being able to make the 53-man roster. And I think you can go into the names behind that, but I think that speaks to the positional needs at other areas for the Giants, where we still have to figure a lot out.
Yeah, we're going to get into, obviously, the 25. So the overall 53-man roster, it's 25 on the offensive side of the ball. So we'll get into the offensive line here as well in a minute. But when you look at it, we're talking about Golladay, Slayton, Shepard, the rookie Tony, and then John Ross is in the mix. Pettis is in the mix. Mack, C.J. Board, Alex Bachman, some of these other names, and Sills, who got brought back in this year. But Valentine has them going with Golladay, Slayton, Shepard, Tony, Pettis. I like this. Like, this makes sense to me. I was intrigued by having a player like Ross come into the room here. And also, I don't understand how he's going to make this 53 if he hasn't been in the camps, right? So that to me makes it a little bit easier to move off of him. And I liked what Pettis flashed for us. Everybody else in some form or fashion can make their way to the practice squad, potentially the younger guys. But to the point of 25 on the offensive side, you'll see why when we get to the defensive side. But I think it's limited. And keeping all 4 tight ends like that, if you're going to, is an indication that you want to have versatility of personnel to be able to have blocking and receiving at that position, depending on what looks you run.
Well, keep in mind in the wide receiver group, and I think this is the number one thing that I saw from what Ed Valentine put out, is Dante Pettis is making the roster over John Ross. Remember, John Ross was signed prior to the draft. And when Kadarius Toney became available in the draft, the Giants selected him in the first round. That changed everything for the Giants. They were like, we need a speedster, a guy that can, stretch the field and really stretch a defense. Well, they got that in Kadarius Toney, so they don't need necessarily what John Ross is going to provide them. At least Dante Pettis, you saw him making some big aerial catches. He's a guy that when he's motivated can make some big time catches and brings that back up to, say, a Kenny Golladay or someone else on the outside when he needs a breather or if he's dinged up for a couple of plays. So I think the fact that Toney was drafted after Ross was signed, they found a better version of John Ross in Kadarius Toney, and so he becomes a little bit more expendable, especially when you don't have Ross being able to show up and show out at some of these camps.
Yeah, 100%. The pre-draft signing, and then what happens, we know how it played out there. The Giants end up trading back, and that changes how they approach it. Turn our attention now over to the offensive line. 14 possible players, 9 in. What surprises you there?
To be honest with you, nothing. I mean, maybe Murphy sneaking in, Kyle Murphy as one of the last pieces, but I think to this point, like we talked about Heggie and some others potentially being the backup center. I think that was somewhere that you had focused on last one. But with Nick Gates, and Zach Fulton and Jonathan Harrison, they kind of have the guard and center backup positions already taken care of. I've told you all along that I think Solder is going to be the swing tackle and is going to be pushing Pert to potentially be the right tackle if he needs that veteran leadership. To me, I don't see anything that's out of the ordinary here, Adam, but I know that you've had some opinions on where we go with backup center potentially.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's Thomas Lemieux, Gates, Hernandez, Pert, and then where to get into it, Harrison, they brought in, obviously, you expect him to be there. Fulton, who we think is going to be in the mix potentially. Again, there seems to be these rumblings about Hernandez earning the starting right guard spot. And then you mentioned Solder. The Giants are also high on Murphy. So it leaves out Slade. Nobody else in particular, Wiggins, Burton bothers me in any way, shape, or form. Hedgie is a guy that I've talked about. I think that he's worth it if he proves it in training camp. And if not, he's still going to be a player that I think makes it through, get onto the practice squad. And I like it in the grand scheme of things, because even if in this year you talk about going from Fulton in, you lost Zeitler last year, right? Fleming out, and then to your point, you bring Solder in or back, and it helps you keep this veteran presence. But fast forward a year from now, I think Solder will be gone. No matter what, come hell or high water, he'll be done. I don't know if Fulton is still going to be there, right? So all these things are going to be very malleable in another season, let alone what happens with Hernandez. So any young talent that you can still keep your hands on is important if it means, for example, that you got an indication that Hedgie might be a viable player that could get picked up by other teams. I think you have to take a hard look at the short and long term and just what your evaluation is on a player like that. So we'll see how it shakes out. I like that there was the indication he could make to the practice squad, but if this does lean into your line of thinking, you have young guys primarily in the starting roles, we assume, and then veterans backing them up, and whether that's for depth, potentially just to plug in and play, or just leadership and experience in the film room. That's more than enough for me.
Yeah, and Adam, I think, when we transition away from the offensive line and we go to the defensive side of the ball, we didn't talk about the quarterback room all that much. I think we don't need to talk about the defensive line all that much. I pretty much see the 5 guys that I thought would be in there in terms of Leonard Williams, Dexter Lawrence, BJ Hill, Austin Johnson, and Danny Shelton. Yep. Sounds like, it was a like-for-like replacement to bring in someone like Danny Shelton. to replace Dalvin Tomlinson. So it feels pretty natural. That was not a part of our defense where we were really had any questions. I think what's fascinating is there are so many players at edge and linebacker because the Giants play a 3-4 defense that it just opens up that extra like whole nother like wormhole of players that to me, when you see, Ed Valentine write off all the different edge players the Giants have and all the different linebackers they have, you start to see that they're, like I said, I think I said it maybe last week or 2 weeks ago, there is just not enough room at the end for some of these players that contributed last year. They won't be able to find a roster spot this upcoming season.
Yeah, interestingly enough, so he has Carter Coughlin, and then we talk about drafted Ojulari, brought in Odenigbo, brought in Anderson, drafted Ellerson Smith, and then last year's late round draft pick in Cam Brown. That comprises the group. On the outs is going to be O'Shane Ximenez, Lalos, Speaks, Harris, and Johnson. The thing that I found interesting was a footnote inside of this was that the coaching staff wasn't exactly enamored with O'Shane Ximenez. I did not know that, and that can be whether it's about a fit, a scheme, attitude, or approach, because, for all intents and purposes, Lorenzo Carter and O'Shane Ximenez were kind of in the same boat, right? Guys coming back, you're expecting them to take a little step. They both suffer from injuries. Now, Carter showed a flash there early before going down, but you thought they were in the same boat of, well, are these guys going to survive this because they both had injuries? Well, now what I'm seeing here is they believe in Lorenzo Carter. They believe that he can start opposite of Ojulari and be an impact player that benefits now from some young athletic talent on the other side. And O'Shane Ximenez was a little bit undersized, a little bit out of place, and maybe didn't show the best in the film room or on the practice squad or in recovery from injury. So something there seems to have soured in that relationship, and that seems to be why you see him being on the outs. And that's I don't want to say a total surprise, but it's a mild surprise to see that he might not get a run potentially. This is all obviously, projected, but when you look at that lineup with the players they drafted and the players they signed, it kind of makes sense that Ximenez might be on the outside looking in.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different things here. One is Lorenzo Carter has shown upside when he is healthy. Like you've seen it on the field. Like he looks like he is a starting defensive player in the NFL. So when you think about him, while the injuries have zapped a lot of the excitement of Giant fans, I think everyone deep down inside knows that he's still there. And you've seen the workout videos. It sounds like the Giant coaching staff is hoping that this guy turns into the player that they want him to be. What I'm a little surprised about is, Ximenez. It sounds like you said, some people aren't enamored with him in the coaching staff for whatever reason. We can probably go into that at a later show. But I'm actually surprised that Cam Brown is sneaking in over him, in that edge rusher discussion. Maybe he's just working harder and he's there and they see him every day and they're just saying, hey, maybe this guy is a better fit. This other guy may have a bunch of talent that needs to be unlocked. We can't figure it out, or he needs to go figure it out. Maybe Cam Brown's more ready to contribute when we can only have 53 guys on this roster.
Well, as you say, carryovers, right? Guys that were there before Joe Judge took over and came in as head coach, and guys that he was a part of the draft class bringing them in. So when you start to compare these players and you say, hey, who can we still squeeze onto this roster to give them a chance here and see what they can do? Guys that Joe Judge had a voice in, or that, the defensive coordinators, coaches, linebacker coaches, when you come out of it from last season, a rookie year, a late round draft pick, if someone gets in here and says, listen, I know Cam Brown, we got a little sample on him, we think we can continue to develop him. And by the way, remember when they drafted him, that's what it was. It was, this guy has some raw talent, but you're going to need to cultivate it. And I think you want to get full second year out of him. So again, by the way, when we're running through this list, I agree almost across the board with everything that Ed Valentine is laying out. Because I think he's doing the right combination of clearly guys that were brought in free agency, but also hanging on to the right young players that are deserving of continuing to have a chance here. When we get inside the linebacker room, there's one little bit of surprise. I think we had mentioned it prior that there had been a bit of a shift here when we talk about the mini camps and OTAs. But again, when you have Martinez, Crowder, Reggie Ragland brought in, Devonte Downs brought back, TJ Brunson, rookie from last year, Garrett, and then the surprise Carter Coughlin officially kicked inside as an inside linebacker now. Valentine has it down to Martinez, Crowder, Ragland, and Coughlin as the four that make it at the linebacker spot, with Downs, Brunson, and Garrett on the outside looking in. I don't think there should be a surprise here, shy of you brought back Downs and he's fine as a depth piece. I think this is projecting that you get beat out, right? Coughlin earns the spot over you, Downs, and there's clearly, again, upside value in a young player that's developing along.
Yeah, they bring in Reggie Ragland because the front office has some familiarity with his experience down, with the Lions. So that he's a veteran presence that's going to stabilize that inside linebacking group. I am surprised about Carter Coughlin. Like, I thought he might be like a roster bubble spot. I know Adam is grinning ear to ear because that's his guy. But I'm genuinely surprised. I didn't think that he necessarily had the size to kick inside the way that the Giants are playing him. But I think they just like what he can contribute overall, and they're just trying to find a roster spot for him. Maybe he could jump in on one of those outside linebacking edge rushing spots in a pinch. Maybe he kind of jumps in and plays in the middle linebacking core. Maybe he's a little bit on special teams too. Like, it feels like they just want to find a roster spot for him. And the only way to do that is because the edge rushing outside linebacker group is so crowded. They have to find room in the inside. And it feels like a TJ Brunson or a Devonte Downs is a depth piece that maybe even if you let them go and they don't make the practice squad and they sign somewhere else, another team is probably going to release a similar type of player that you could bring in to have as a depth piece if you want. It doesn't seem like either of them is like, we cannot lose this guy, like everyone thought Ryan Connolly was going to be last year.
Yeah. It's a great example, calling back to the way some fans felt when that all played out. And I think too, you talk about Carter Coughlin, you put him into the linebacker, you kick him inside. You have to think about when they're running these different schemes, you start to run 3 high safety looks. Where do you want to bring blitz packages out of? Potentially Carter Coughlin would be more valuable on the interior, bringing pressure at the quarterback, along with Ojulari, along with Lorenzo Carter, and you're not as worried about some of the coverage pieces. So I think speed and quickness, depending on down and distance, can just allow versatility for Patrick Graham on the defensive side. Here's where we get into the quarterback safety group. I found this pretty interesting. I will say, if there's one area that, and I'm not even say I disagree, but when we've gone through on both sides of the ball, well, could you keep another wide receiver potentially? Or was it one too many tight ends possibly, with all of these bodies in the linebacking room? Edge, are we going a little bit too thin potentially? Is there a talent you want to keep? Then you get into the cornerback room. Now remember, you've got Sam Beal, James Bradbury, Darnay Holmes, Dory Jackson, Jaron Williams, Quincy Williams, Aaron Robinson, Rodarius Williams, Madre Harper, Isaac Yadam, Joshua Kalu, and Chris Milton. That is just the cornerbacks, not even the safeties. Valentine put it down as Bradbury, Jackson, Holmes, Robinson, and Harper being the 5 that make it. So I'll put it to you this way. I think Harper's probably the one spot, right? The 5th one where you'd go, who would you maybe rather have? Is there anybody who's on the quote outs that you would instantly put in there in place of Harper?
Yes. And it's Isaac Yedem. I think, the Giants took a flyer on him last year and he was getting burned early on in the season. And then as that Giant defense started becoming a unit and getting a little bit more cohesive and gelling, it seems like he played better. Right? Like, I don't know if it's just me, but it seemed like his play on the field, he wasn't getting burned the same way he was before. I think that he's a serviceable guy. If Bradbury or Dory Jackson goes down with an injury, for a handful of plays or a couple quarters, like maybe you could get away with him on the outside, like protecting you. I don't think he's the long-term answer where you just put him at the cornerback number 2 or he's the slot guy or anything like that. But I think he provides a depth piece that Madre Harper, to me, doesn't really provide. I didn't see enough out of Harper last year for him to warrant a roster spot over a guy like Yedem, who played so many snaps and the Giants saw him so much and they saw him grow. I think the unfortunate situation of the other outs is that, man, when you look at how many cornerbacks the Giants have, there is almost no chance Sam Beal makes this roster. Like, there's so many guys. Like, at this point, you'd rather have Rodarius Williams and take a flyer on him than anything that you've seen from Sam Beal. So, like, I look at this whole thing and I never realized really how deep the Giants cornerback room was. Like, we talked about it, but then you see all the names on paper and how many spots there are. And man, I just don't see Beal having any shot at making this roster.
No, I just think that the room's too full. And again, there's no loyalty on this coaching staff to that particular player. He's another holdover. To your point, it's kind of, I'm a little bit split. I think Madre Harper, what he showed you was, this is what I remember in his sample size. Very aggressive, very hard hitter, very physical player. I think those things you like. Also, gets a lot of penalties called on him, takes a lot of risks, a little bit erratic, right? So I think it's the high pendulum swing on him. To your point, I thought Yadam did steadily improve, but you did get a big sample size. So I wonder how the Giants view him, right? They say, it wasn't bad, but also maybe we feel like there's a ceiling there. If I was going to take a flyer on a guy, maybe it would be Rodarius Williams because you just brought him in. Obviously, in this version, Ed has him making it to the practice squad, which makes all the sense in the world to me. But I do think when you sit there and look at it, Harper's spot, the 5th cornerback, that's up for grabs. Anybody can earn that thing. Madre Harper can earn it. Yadam can earn that. Rodarius Williams. I don't know about some of these other players that are listed in there. You got 3 Williams among this group, but anybody could. And theoretically, yes, even Sam Beal could accomplish that feat, though I think he probably has the hardest hill to climb. But the top 4 spots, Bradbury, Jackson, Holmes, and Robinson, I think we lock those in. That's what you're moving forward with. And what becomes interesting is, as we'll close out here on the safeties, footnote about special teams, but the reason why you're maybe only carrying 5 cornerback spots is because Joe Judge came out and said Nate Ebner, after he's done with his rugby obligations, he's going to be on this roster. So if Nate Ebner is going to be back on this roster, when you right now have Logan Ryan, Peppers, McKinney, Love, and Montre Hardage, you have to throw Ebner in there as well. So now it's Ryan, Peppers, McKinney, Love, and Ebner as the 5 safeties in that room right now. Does that surprise you at all? Hardage being out is kind of neither here nor there, but do you think that carrying 5 safeties is worth it if it's coming at the cost maybe of one of those young cornerbacks or a veteran linebacker, wherever you want to, wherever you want to use it, right? Do you feel like it's worth it to carry that extra spot at the safety position?
So most people will look at this and say, well, Joe Judge had Nate Ebner on special teams back in New England, and that is the reason why he loves this guy. He has a leadership, intangibles. I'm sure that plays a part of it. Mm-hmm. But Adam, there's a much, much, much simpler answer. And that answer is Julian Love can play both cornerback and safety. He is the Swiss Army knife of that secondary. So he's like being able to carry a 6th cornerback without actually having to carry a 6th cornerback. So really, when you think it's all about Nate Ebner, it's about Julian Love's flexibility in that secondary that allows Joe Judge to make one of these changes and leave a guy like Rodarius Williams, who he may be slightly of a better cornerback than even say Julian Love, but Julian Love's versatility for this team allows the coaching staff to bring in Nate Ebner for that specific reason.
And take it a layer deeper, right? Talk about the fact that we have Logan Ryan, who can play multiple positions out of the safety spot, or a player like Xavier McKinney that we believe, when we get to see more and more of him, is going to be versatile in terms of what assignments he can pick up potentially. Even Jabril Peppers, not in coverage necessarily, but being able to come down in the box and be the extra linebacker against the run, right? So what you're talking about is having a collection of 10 players and feeling like, and this is what you're hearing and what we all kind of suspected, you're going to get a lot of versatility out of this secondary under Patrick Graham. Think about what happened last year defensively, but now with a better talent pool. That's what this is talking about. Everything that Graham tried to do and did pretty darn effectively with a lot of spare parts. Now there's a lot more guys that are entrenched in their roles, obviously adding a Dory Jackson, right? All of a sudden, that opens up everything that's possible, and it really is going to be intriguing to see what the final combination of this 53 is, and training camp being a little ways away, but we'll start to get a sense of who is really taking on those roles and identifying, hey, I am the key contributor here, especially on defense. I feel like a very interesting watch over the course of this offseason.
You hit the nail on the head at the end, Adam, with a Dory Jackson. That signing towards the end of the free agency period, which was surprising, changed everything for the Giants. If he's not signed by the Giants, I am convinced that Yedem is on this roster and may even be starting at the cornerback number 2 position, because Like, that's how important a Dory Jackson signing was. He changes the landscape for everything. You have so much more flexibility on defense. I'm glad you called that out, because we didn't really mention him by name because we're talking about some of the guys that are making the roster. But guys like Julian Love and signing a Dory Jackson late provide a lot of flexibility. You mentioned Jabril Peppers. He also provides that flexibility in the linebacking core. This is a Swiss Army knife defense where Patrick Graham is going to have a ton of different looks to be able to throw at defenses. I know people still may say we don't have enough edge rushing or pass rushing in this group, but if Ojulari pans out the way that we hope, Leonard Williams continues to get the pressure that he has been, and we just have a complementary group of guys that can still rush the quarterback or get pressure, man, I feel really good about the state of this defense.
As we've said, you can't fix every problem and fill every hole in one offseason, in one draft, and one free agency. So the Giants looked at that landscape and they made the secondary infinitely better. Even Julian Love benefits from the signing of Dory Jackson because it takes the pressure off him and they'll be able to execute and use him where he's best suited. Go back to when Joe Judge took the job. I want to put players in the best position to do what they do best and mitigate putting them in spots to do things that they don't do well.
It sounds cliche, Adam. It sounds cliche, and then you see what Joe Judge is doing, and the Nate Ebner situation is a perfect example of that. It's like he's really good at motivating and being a leader of a special teams group. That's what we are going to do. We are not going to ask him to play safety. We will lose a cornerback because of this, but guess what? Julian Love, you're really good at situationally being a cornerback or a safety, someone in the secondary. It's like, sometimes you think it's lip service and these guys go through the motions. Then other times you start seeing it play out when you look at the construction of the roster.
Tip of the hat. As we say at the end of the day, Ed Valentine put together a pretty good, I think, projection of where this 53-man roster can go. Will be interesting to see. There's some young players, a Rodarius Williams, guys that'll get into camp. Maybe someone flashes and surprises us. Maybe a wide receiver like Andy's namesake, Mr. Mack, will find his way up there somehow, but this is a good sense of where things are going to go. As you know, friends, you can follow us live on YouTube doing the podcast. You can also follow and listen wherever you get your podcast needs fulfilled at One Giant Podcast on social media. We'll be back again doing the darn thing. Thank you for the YouTube support in these dog days of the off season. As training camp starts to ramp up, we will start to ramp up our coverage as well. And in between, we'll talk about some of those players that we think are crucial to Big Blue's run in the upcoming season. Until next time, though, as Andy Makowitz, I will say one thing. Play pause. I've known Andy for a handful of years now, and only the last couple episodes have I completely lost the ability to pronounce his name.
Well, that's just because you've been drinking far too much the last couple of weeks, so it's much more difficult to throw out those 10 letters. But
erroneous, as Andy Makowitz would want, need, and clink clink wants you to know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.